Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the ongoing general elections coverage by Town Meeting Television. This is one of a series of forums we're bringing to you in advance of the general election in November. Town Meeting TV is hosting forums with all candidates and covering all of the ballot items you will see on your November ballot. We'd like to introduce you to community decision makers and connect you with issues that shape your local community. If you're watching this live, we welcome your questions. You can call in at 802-862-3966. You can watch Town Meeting TV on Comcast Channel 1087, Burlington Telecom Channel 17 and 217, as well as online at youtube.com/townmeetingtv. And with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists. Mark, why don't we have you go first? If you can introduce yourselves and outline your general view of Proposal 2 and how you are personally or politically affected by this issue.
Sure, happy to do it. And thanks for having me. It's good to see you, Zariah. It's good to see you again as well, Peter. Sure. And I am the executive director of the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. Some of the work that we've been doing, well, all of the work that we've been doing has been, as you know, surrounding systemic racism, addressing root causes, impacts, solutions. And leading up to the time that PR2 was introduced, most people know that in addition to the racial disparities in the criminal and juvenile justice system advisory panel, that we also were successful at. It was a second pass. The governor vetoed the first one, but we did get the executive director of racial equity passed. So that was kind of leading up to. We did have our eyes on the Constitution. We were aware that in Article 1 that there's language in Article 1 that does provide for exceptions that permit slavery. Mm-hmm. And because the process only happens every 4 years, we were required to wait until 2019 to introduce it. Although in 2018 we did go in and provide we introduced through Representative Chena a House resolution that urged the 2019 Senate to initiate it, because as you probably know, can only initiate in the Senate every 4 years. So definitely, we're thinking about, okay, what more of a cornerstone can we really deal with than the institution of slavery in a conversation about systemic racism. So very much focused on it, and also always have been transparently intentional about coming back to this conversation later. So at some point or another, we can start having conversations about amending or replacing the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which also provides for an exception clause to slavery. So yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to a lively discussion.
Great. And Peter, we'll go to you next. And when you're done, I will also be reading the ballot language, the Proposal 2 language, so folks have that exactly. But if you can go ahead and introduce yourself and your role.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and to join my good friend Mark Hughes on this. We share many, many things in common. We have some slight differences about how you read Article 1 and what the impact of Prop 2 would be, but and we'll probably have a chance to ventilate those differences and shared views this evening. I'm a professor of law at Vermont Law School with a specialty in constitutional law and Vermont constitutional history. Those are areas that I have been fields of interest ever since I started teaching at Vermont Law School. This issue is of particular personal interest to me and professional interest because it deals with one of the most important provisions in the Vermont Constitution, Article 1, which generally has been understood to abolish slavery in the state and to stand for the first constitutional provision ever to have abolished slavery. We'll get back to later in the evening how it purports to do so, what's the basis in Article 1 for claiming that it abolished slavery, but that is my interest. What's involved is if I could anticipate just a little, a very fundamental proposition that is important to me. And it's the very first words of Article 1 begin that all are born equally free and independent, and they have certain inalienable rights, the rights to pursue liberty, and to own and possess property, and to pursue and obtain happiness, something that we're all still working on. But in any event, that idea that all persons, without exception, no matter what age, are born equally free and independent is an extremely important proposition, and that's where my personal and professional interest lies.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. And just so folks have the full ballot language, Article 1 starts out at that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. It goes on that therefore, and then this is the proposal to cross out, no person born in this country or brought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any persons as a servant, slave, or apprentice after arriving to the age of 21 years, unless bound by the person's own consent after arriving to such age or bound by law for the payment of debts, damages, fines, costs, or the like. So that's crossed out to read, therefore, slavery and indentured servitude in any form are prohibited. So that's the exact language that we're talking about. And if you could, and Mark, I think you started to get into this, but tell us a little bit more about your understanding of the history of this particular proposal, why this is the exact language that is in front of us, and the process that brought us here.
Definitely. And I think it's like super important for everybody to understand just how complex, I think Peter would definitely agree, or I should say detailed the process is to amend the Constitution in the state of Vermont, probably unparalleled compared to most other states. 4-year process starts again in 2023, and can only be initiated in the Senate. It requires a 2/3 vote out of the Senate. Then there's after that 2/3 vote in the first biennium, it goes to the House. There must be a public hearing, and then there needs to be a majority vote in the House, and then that happens again the next year. I think absent the 2/3, it cannot be amended throughout the entire process. Where we started was we had certain ideas about what the language should look like, and we were kind of vacillating because we weren't really sure. We weren't like professors of of the Constitution, so we were trying to get it figured out. But what we were sure about is that we wanted to make sure that the Constitution was amended to reflect, to make it very clear that slavery was prohibited. Just to piggyback on what Peter was just saying a minute ago, he said that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain and natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, and it goes on. But then it goes on to say, after no person born or brought from overseas ought to be holden by law to serve any person or as a servant, slave, or apprentice after arriving at the age of 21 years, unless bound by a person's own consent after arriving to such age or bound by law for the payment of debts, fines, costs, or the like. So you'll hear tonight, I'm sure, from Peter about, there'll be a lot of conversation about what the original framers of this document intended. I don't know if there's anybody alive who can really authoritatively speak about that, but we'll hear it. And I think that we'll probably, dance around, with the language, concerning the portion concerning the rights as they're expressed. But at the end of the day, no matter how many times we dance around this tonight, we're still going to be sitting in front of a Constitution that has 3 exception clauses that provide provisions to permit slavery. No matter how we slice it and dice it, at the end of the day, that's where we're going to end up. That's what we saw then. That's what we've seen throughout the entire process. That's what we see tonight. That's what our folks who have received your ballots. That's what you see, And I think that's why the voters we got some pretty smart voters out there. They're going to look at it and say this is unacceptable, and they're going to take it in our direction. We're going to win it.
Peter, any follow-up questions on the process and how we came to this language specifically for Proposal 2?
Well, let me echo what Mark said. First of all, the process is a lengthy one, intentionally lengthy, to make sure that we don't make amendments in an arbitrary, on-again, off-again way. And I also want to recognize that Mark played an instrumental role in initiating the process and following through with the process in the Vermont legislature. I got involved long after he was initially involved, when I was contacted by Senator Jeanette White of the Senate Government Operations Committee. And she said, Peter, would you come up and help us understand this? The senators have introduced a proposal to amend Article 1, and the basis of that is the view that that Article 1 only partially prohibits slavery. Okay? Is that true or is that not true? And she said, they also want to get rid of the word slavery in the Vermont Constitution. Just the word and term, the recognition of the institution somehow is offensive. What options do we have if that's the way we want to decide to go? So that's how I initially got involved, and I went up and I testified, well, it depends on what you mean by abolish slavery or prohibit slavery. And I explained, and what do you mean by partially prohibit? And I say, if the argument is that Article 1 allows slaves, minor slaves, non-adult slaves, to be freely bought and sold in Vermont, that's not true, I said. On the other hand, there are very limited bedrock rules for what abolition means, and they are very limited. There are all sorts of problems and complications that this article does not currently deal with. And I also said it's quite easy to see how the language of the amendment could be unclear and confusing. I happen to be a legal historian. I spend a lot of time on this. Not everybody in the state is that. And if this language continues to cause confusions and problems, maybe we ought to do something about that. So that's how I got involved initially.
Mm-hmm. Great. And a reminder that if folks would like to call in, we are taking live questions at 802-862-3966. But now with another of our questions, Peter, I'll have you take this one first, but Vermont is unique in having this language around involuntary servitude for a decent amount of time, as well as calling out these exceptions. Why do you think this language is still part of the Vermont Constitution and has persisted for so long?
Okay, that's a really good question. I think it can be a little bit confusing, however. First of all, the Vermont Constitution does not use the term involuntary servitude. It does refer clearly in the second section, which Mark was referring to what was called indentured servitude, which was a very common practice at that time. And it allowed people to be bound not only by themselves, but by their parents, maybe even by a ship captain, to work for a period of years without salary for simply room and board. Mm-hmm. And what the second section does is said, that's okay, nothing wrong with the institution, it's to everybody's benefit, in some ways mutually beneficial, but we want to put a limit to abuses. So they said, once you reach the age of majority, you can no longer be bound except by your own consent. So that's part of it. Then there's the third section, which basically says, unless you are bound by law to pay debts, court fees, fines, damages, that sort of thing. So there's a second exception which has to do with imprisonment for debts and debt prisons. And I will have to tell you, that was also a very common practice back in 1777 when this Constitution was adopted. So how do those two interrelate, we can come to later, but the Constitution itself really says there's the indentured servitude problem, we want to put a limit to abuses, and there's the imprisonment for debt problem. imprisonment for debt, they didn't put any limits on it, it seems to me. So those are two different problems. And why do you think it's still in the Constitution? Well, I will tell you the Vermont Constitution does have a provision in the Constitution, Chapter 2, Section 40, which in so many terms says there shall be no imprisonment for debt. So that sort of superseded that little tail end provision. Okay.
2010 constitutional amendment.
Yeah. So that part of the question, I think, can be answered, that imprisonment for debt is no longer constitutionally or legally possible in Vermont. Now, there are ways to kind of get around that just a little bit. For example, if somebody doesn't show up for child support hearing, doesn't show up when a court has ordered the individual to pay child support, what courts do is that they can find that individual in contempt and can imprison the individual for contempt, but they can't imprison him for failure to pay the debt. So there are kind of ways to get around that a little bit. But in any event, simple answer, it's still in the Constitution, the imprisonment for debt, because it's been superseded. The other provision is the difficult one and the complicated one.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Peter. Mark, anything to add on why Vermont is unique in indentured servitude, which sounds like it may or may not have been involuntary, depending on the age and time of the person, and why this has persisted?
You know, why it's persistent, who knows? It's really entertaining to listen to Peter go through it, and I know there was some extensive testimony that was rendered surrounding this. I actually was reading some of it today. So the whole thing is interesting, but again, at the end of the day, we still come back to a Constitution that has 3 clauses in it that clearly indicate that there are circumstances under which slavery is constitutionally permitted. I would go back to one of the things that Peter was that you were just mentioning earlier, and I just want to flag for those who are watching that you have been at the law school for about 47 years down there.
Father Time here.
so you wrote some of these constitutional amendments, you know. You've been around for a while, and you probably are you embody some of these conversations that we're talking about because you were there when it happened. Say, for example, like the Constitutional Amendment of 1994 with Proposal 11, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You know, where which actually prompted some additional work, some legislative work. We'll talk more about that later when we start talking about the term freeman, because this definitely came up during our deliberations. But I would just say that as far as the indentured servitude, you know, it kind of speaks to, like I said, just our ignorance. We were just like, just take slavery out of the Constitution, which was dumb because it really led to ahead with, you know, us and the NAACP, because we were saying, yep, looks good. And they're like, but slavery's still in there. And we're like, it says slavery is prohibited. And they were saying, but it's in there. And so it was really messy. And we had to take some time off, Peter, to figure out, you know, what to do about that. So our desire or our demands or our expectations, I guess you would say, evolved over a period of time. The more we came to understand what we were actually asking for. Mm-hmm. Really, what we're asking for is really not even only that the language in the Constitution be removed, but there be clear and emphatic language in the Constitution that states that slavery is prohibited under all circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And so to move to a conversation about impact and contextualizing this into a wider context, mm-hmm. I mean, this isn't in a vacuum. I think we've had, as a country, questions about the evolution of slavery and how that manifests in the prison system. Of course, questions even historically about debtors' prisons, which of course didn't start in the U.S., and mm-hmm. who that impacts. And so do you see this as part of a bigger movement? And if so, what context does that have, and what impact do you think it will have, especially nationally?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally part of a bigger movement. You know, our partners at the Abolish Slavery National Network have been doing the work. We've been partnering with them. Currently, there's 4 states that have abolished slavery. Today, there's 5 on the ballot. Vermont's one of them. So we've got 4 other states that are out there. And as we said back in 2019, we still envision being a country where for once in our existence that we could be a country where slavery is not permitted. Because as soon as the ink dried in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, all we did was move from chattel slavery to prison and state slavery. I'd also add back to a point that we were making about this whole idea of debt prison, if you will, or debtor's prison, or I call it the criminalization of poverty. It shouldn't be lost on us that we don't have jails here in Vermont, which means anybody who goes to jail is in prison in this state. And what we know and understand is that if you look at the national numbers of the 1/3 of the 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, somewhere it's about 800,000 folks, of those, 60% of them are in there because they can't pay bail. And that averages out to be about 300 folks in the state of Vermont in prison because they can't pay bail.
Is that? Peter, do you have anything to add in terms of context as far as this being a bigger movement, the history of it?
Well, I think I want to take a step back, if it's okay with you, and say, well, what does it mean to say that this first Constitution abolished slavery? Because it means some things, but it doesn't mean other things. And it's really important to know exactly what was meant legally. What it did mean, and when the Vermont Supreme Court made this clear, it meant that no inhabitant of the state of Vermont could legally own a slave. Vermont read that first section that way, that all persons are born equally free and independent. No person, no inhabitant of the state can legally own a slave. Second of all, it meant that you can't purchase legally or sell legally slaves in Vermont. I don't care what age, and this is where Mark and I may disagree, but that's what the court said. You simply cannot legally buy or sell slaves in the state of Vermont. The third thing the court said, if you buy a slave out of the state and get a bill of sale and you've got it in your pocket showing you own that slave, the minute you cross the border into the state of Vermont, that bill of sale is no longer legally recognizable. Those are the 3 things that was meant by abolition of slavery. But now let me tell you what it didn't mean. It didn't mean that you couldn't buy a slave out of state and illegally bring the slave into the state and continue to claim personally, socially, ownership of the slave. You couldn't do so legally, but you could do that, okay? And in fact, as Mark knows, were the Vermonters who in fact did that. Some of the Ethan Allen's family, in fact, purchased slaves out of the state and brought them into the state and kept them there. And it seemed to be a practice that was condoned by certain respectable parts of the Burlington community. A Vermont Supreme Court justice named Jacob, who was a lawyer down in Windsor, bought a slave over in New Hampshire, brought her back. When she turned out to get sick and he didn't want to keep her anymore, he dumped her on the town of Windsor. So it didn't prohibit people from bringing slaves into the state illegally, but it did prohibit anyone from claiming legal ownership of a slave in the state. And where we differ is, how did that apply to minors? Well, the court, when it talks about it, says it doesn't matter whether you're a minor or an adult, you cannot legally buy and sell slaves in the state. And I've always said, if the opposite was true, show me a Vermont case, where the court upheld a bill of sale for a slave, because they wouldn't do it because they couldn't, because of Article 1.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add something to that, just for clarity, because I don't want the train to get off the rails here with perhaps some inaccurate information or maybe incomplete information. I'm trying to be like nice to Peter because he hurt his leg not too long ago, and I don't want to come at him too hard. But that Supreme Court decision that the professor keeps referring to is the Jacobs decision. And the decision was really not, it was not a decision, a court decision on slavery. The court decision was actually a decision as to whether or not Jacobs would have to repay the town of Windsor for keeping her after he threw her out. And hypocritically, and at the time, Jacobs was a member of the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, just so we can get the whole story here. And after recusing himself, his colleagues on the Supreme Court would not allow the bill of sale to be permissible. Talk about hypocritical. They would not allow the bill of sale to be admissible in the court after she had resided with Stephen Jacobs for 17 years as his slave and refused to care for her after she got blind and he threw her out. The only reason that case was in court was because Windsor was suing Jacobs for the money and he didn't want to pay it, and he got off the hook because his colleagues let him off the hook, and they used the technicality of inadmissibility of the bill of sales. So not only do I find that offensive, I find that to be a personal affront. And really, it's ridiculous that that particular court case would even be used in this particular conversation. I mean, I cannot tell you how ridiculous the whole conversation is full circle. All I'm really getting at is that a decision of inadmissibility based upon the fact that his colleagues said that that particular bill of sales is not valid, despite the fact that he had her as a slave for 17 years, is not a court decision that says slavery is legal in the state of is illegal in the state of Vermont. There's two. I may not be a professor at the law school, but I know that. Now, to be clear about this whole business, about this person's business, I want to talk about that too. Because
can I ask one more question and
Sure.
then you get back to that near Marek? Is that okay?
Sure.
So, Peter, and also just to maybe get back to the question on the larger movement and impact that I had asked Mark, that I think you were responding to is, so you had said that legally it wasn't allowed, which doesn't mean it wasn't practice. And so do you have any thoughts on how that tension between what is legal and what is allowed maybe how that affects the conversation that we're having today in terms of criminalizing poverty or in terms of the evolution of slavery or any of those?
Well, I think it is an important question, because I say what abolishing slavery meant to the framers' generation just meant those three things. One, you can't legally own a slave in Vermont. Two, you can't legally buy and sell a slave in Vermont. And three, a bill of sale that you might have gotten in some other state, when it comes into this state, no longer is legally enforceable. Now, Mark has trouble with that because he said Jacobs was a colleague of the other justices on the Supreme Court who ruled that way.
Justice, yeah.
But I will tell you, there's no evidence that they had any particular respect for or admiration for or felt collegial toward the third justice, Jacob. I will tell you that if the shoe had been on the other foot, if Dinah Mason, the slave, had become healthy after he dumped her on the town and let the town, and he said, wait a minute, I want her back. I'm going to introduce the bill of sale I got over in New Hampshire to show that I'm the legal owner and I'm entitled to have her. The Supreme Court of Vermont would have ruled exactly the same way because they did so not as a matter of collegial hypocrisy, but as a matter of principle, because the Vermont Constitution says all persons are born equally free and independent, and to allow one person to claim ownership over another is fundamentally inconsistent with that bedrock principle. So this is where we disagree a little bit, but I haven't found no evidence at all that they did so for cynical or improper motives. It was a matter of principle, and everything that they wrote and said indicates it was a matter of principle.
Great. And just to go back, do you have any thoughts on how that impacts any of the conversations that we're having today in terms of, not a legal question, it's a morality question.
No, that's really an important question. We come back to it, which is to say that what abolishing slavery meant had a very limited meaning. It didn't prohibit people from bringing slaves illegally into the state. People did it, okay? I think that was, the constitutional provisions can only do so much, and it didn't prohibit that. It didn't in any way impact on what you might call the seeds of systemic racism in this country, because to say whether or not you can legally bring a slave into the state is a practical matter, you can. It obviously contributes to a kind of reaffirms racist tendencies on the part of some people. So it is an important limitation. All I'm saying is when you talk about abolishing slavery in Article 1, it just had that limited meaning.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you another question, Mark, and then you can go to some of the things you were maybe trying to get to that I interrupted.
We got plenty of time. Maybe they'll just vote it down and we'll have another 4 years.
Which is the question of Vermont exceptionalism. So we're talking a lot about what is allowed versus what is enforced. And part of that is also the story of Vermont being referred to as an abolitionist state. And I'm curious as to how you think this proposal affects the story, but also again, I'd love to bring it back to the present, not just the Supreme Court decisions at the time or the original Constitution, to being what does that mean about what does that mean about the conversation we're having as a state now today? So any thoughts on Vermont as a
exceptionalism? I get tired of talking about Vermont as being exceptionalism, and I think it's really, I don't think it's respectfully, I don't think it's a really good use of our time. But I do think that, there's much to say, about where we are, just being kind of stuck, because there are many people who are, just, infatuated with our history, our past. I respect that Peter is a historian. He didn't mention much about it, but he's not just a professor and a constitutional law expert, but he's also he's a historian buff, and I respect that. I like that a lot about him. And there's a lot of folks who embrace that. But here we are. We are here. This is now, and this is the work that we're doing. As I said at the top of the hour, is focused on systemic racism. We know, like I told you again at the top of the hour, when the smoke clears, you're still going to have a constitution that that has some evidence that there were some circumstances under which slavery was permitted. Back to the broader implications. What we didn't really talk about is the fact that Vermont was the first state to constitutionalize slavery in any way. To be clear, that's what Vermont was the first to do. There was never a state in the United States that had any language concerning slavery within their constitution at all before Vermont. I can say that categorically because we figured that out along the way. And what they did is when they did become the first state to introduce slavery into their constitution, they did so not with an abolition, but with 3 exception clauses. There would go on to be Ohio, Oregon, and Alabama, and the Northwest Territory, who would also emulate Vermont by creating exception clauses. So would the United States in the 13th Amendment. And then towards the Civil War, towards the end of the Civil War, almost another 24 states would emulate Vermont with the introduction of what we call exception clauses into their constitutions as well. We should feel exceptional. We started something. It wasn't good. It was a mess, because what it created was a gateway into convict leasing nationally. So yes, there are broader implications. All of this we figured out along the way. Regarding this argument about persons, to explode that, what I'm holding in my hand right now is this is Proposal 11, 2014. The language of persons never existed in our Constitution in Article 1 before 1994. Mm-hmm. You wrote this with the Supreme Court.
I did. Yeah.
You're on the transmittal. So
Okay, go on.
So
Tell me what I wrote.
the bottom line is that, you know, you keep talking about the Article 1 saying persons and therefore persons. Now, the reason why we're in the bushes is because we just got pulled in the bushes. When we get out of the bushes, we're still, again, when the smoke clears, we're still going to be looking at a constitution that says that there are 3 exception clauses for slavery. You can slice this thing, dice it, bring on Dick McCormick next week, whatever. We can have that conversation with him too. Bottom line is that what we're here to do is to abolish slavery. That is all. All of these intentions and all that other stuff as well. Done the homework. We pulled the Constitutional Amendment for 1994. We see that the original language in Article 1 says that all men, and there are probably, upwards of, I would say maybe 27 other instances where you've inserted persons in this in 1994, as well as 28 instances where you removed freemen, although you decided to leave it at the heading of Chapter 42. So all I'm really getting at here with this is that argument about persons is invalid because it was not language in the original Constitution. If we were to have a conversation about this whole, persons business, I'd rather be having a conversation about whether or not we're just going to abolish slavery in our Constitution.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, I'll let you answer that specific thing as well, but also to go back to the question, also curious to hear what you think about how this proposal affects the story of who Vermont has been and who we want to be, and also feel free to respond to Mark.
Well, we've got quite a complex set of questions now, so I'll get to that last one, and don't let me get away from doing that. First of all, I confess guilt that I am responsible in part for a movement to try to propose and have the Vermont Constitution rewritten in gender-neutral language. And we did that because of a deep sense that the language of the Vermont Constitution ought to reflect the reality that men and women are equal. I did make suggestions about how to do that, and one of them was that we change the word man wherever we find it to person. The Supreme Court, however, was authorized for making those changes, and it was very deliberately constrained in doing so. You cannot change the meaning of these provisions by making the language gender neutral. What does that mean? It means that men, and Mark is absolutely right, in the original Constitution was the term that was used, but it was used in the generic sense, as it often is and has been, to include men, women, children. All men are born equally free and independent. Men are not born. That includes minors as well.
Well, black people weren't men at that time. Not to the 14th Amendment were black people men.
It was.
That's why it matters.
Mark, let's wait for a rebuttal.
Okay, in any event, that was the understanding, and it was. I don't believe there was an understanding that the framers thought, well, women can be legally bought and sold in the state of Vermont. There's no evidence at all that it was read that way. Okay, so I will just say men was used generically. It was understood generically to include men, women, boys, girls, everybody, okay, persons. And that's all the Supreme Court was authorized to do when it rendered the Vermont Constitution in gender-neutral language. Second point, in response to Mark, Vermont was the first state to constitutionalize slavery. He is absolutely right. It's the first state to include the word slavery in a state constitution. Now, why did that happen? Well, as I said before, the primary concern with the second section of Article 1 was to prevent abuse of the institution of indentured servitude by saying, if you're a servant, I don't care, or an apprentice, I don't care what the terms are in which you arrived in that status, when you reach the age of 21, maturity, you cannot continue to be bound by some legal document without your own consent. Now, somebody at the Constitution Convention said, you know what'll happen? These scumbags that are bringing slaves into the state from other states illegally will say, oh, we're not covered by that provision, making maturity a cutoff of the period of time in which you can be bound without your consent. Make sure that slaves, if there are that have been brought illegally into the state, are entitled to the exact same protections. So that's how it gets in. If that's what it means to constitutionalize slavery, that's what it means. But that's how that slavery got into that second section of the Constitution. Now, does
this
all
change the
of this
narrative
stuff, does all of this stuff we're talking about somehow tarnish that sense that Vermont was basically a leading abolitionist state? It was the first state to, in fact, ban or prohibit slavery in the limited sense that I said. No, it doesn't tarnish it at all. The first major section of Article 1 still is retained there. Vermont was the state in which Lincoln got the highest percentage of votes in the 1860 election because it was so strongly an anti-slavery state. Vermont contributed probably as many or almost as many soldiers to the Civil War as any other northern state, volunteer soldiers. Okay. It runs counter to Vermont's history to say that somehow it embraced slavery, it favored slavery.
I don't think that's ever been the point.
On the other hand, as we've recognized, it only was what abolition meant was simply those three core legal requirements, and it didn't deal away with slavery or racism as a problem in the state, and the state's history is really quite complicated in that other respect.
Great. So we'll go to final question. Mark will have a rebuttal. Everybody just gets 1 minute because we're going to run out of time. And so, Mark, feel free to address any
Life history.
any rebuttals as well. But I think I would love if you could just state how you specifically are encouraging voters to vote on this ballot item, and yeah, any other misinformation or any last things that you want to say.
Well, first, I just want to say that at the end of the day, you know, here we are. This is where I told you we'd be at the end of this conversation. We still have a constitution that provides provisions for slavery. I figured if I let Peter talk long enough, he'd convince you to say yes. He actually has been my best advocate in the legislature. He was at yes, then he was at no, then he was at yes, and I think you might be at no again. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think if anybody who's watched the entire program, I don't think there's anything left for me to say actually. So I just want to, more importantly, just thank you, and thank the folks for having us come out. Let's abolish slavery.
Thanks, Mark. Peter, how are you?
Two words. The proposal as it exists came out of the Senate Government Operations Committee. We really sat down and discussed all these issues very thoughtfully and very intelligently, very responsibly. Different members of the committee differed. But in the end, my view was, look, the truth is Vermont was the first state constitution to abolish slavery in this limited sense. But if this language is going to continue to be a source of confusion and difficulty,
wait for it,
then you can make it clean and simple by adopting the language of Proposition 2. I confess I'm guilty in that respect too, Mark. I actually said, hey, why don't we copy something like the Colorado proposition? Just say indentured servitude and slavery are prohibited and get rid of all the stuff that's causing problems. So it's okay with me if people vote for it. I think we lose a little bit of historical sense, but that is a small price to pay if we just have something clean and simple. So, yeah.
Great. And there you have it, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Town Meeting TV, ongoing coverage of statewide and regional candidates and ballot items. You can find this and more forums at www.ch17.tv. Don't forget to vote on or before November 8th. This year, ballots will be mailed to all registered voters in the state. Thank you for watching and sharing Town Meeting TV. If you're not already, please subscribe to our Town Meeting TV YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining.